The true origin of the Orc race was one of the questions that troubled Tolkien the most, and throughout his lifetime he spent countless hours pondering an answer to this elusive question. Is it possible that the orcs were created by Morgoth, or did he use his powers of corruption to turn some innocent creature into these hideous forms of life? And if so, might these creatures have been men and elves? Hey guys, it's Carl here, and in today's episode we'll be delving into the dark origins of the Orc race. So throughout his lifetime, Tolkien came up with various ideas to explain the origins of the orcs, and by following his notes, we can see how Tolkien slowly developed his story over time, and sometimes changed these origins drastically. In Tolkien's earliest writings, the orcs were actually created by Morgoth out of the earth itself. To quote, "For all that race were bred by Melkor out of the subterranean heats and slime. Their hearts were of granite and their bodies deformed." Now it seems like Tolkien tried to build upon this idea at first, that Morgoth somehow created the orcs using elements from the earth, though in their next origin we can start to see some of their elven roots. For according to this origin, after Morgoth poisoned the two trees of Valinor, he escaped to his fortress of Utumno, and within its pits, he would create a new creature out of stone, the savage orc race. It appears that when Morgoth created the orcs, he was partially inspired by the elves, for he intentionally shaped these creatures to be a hideous form of the elves so that he could mock their creation. To quote, "It is said that when Morgoth returned to Middle-earth after the destruction of the two trees, he brought into being the race of the orcs, and they grew and multiplied in the bowels of the earth. These orcs Morgoth made in envy and mockery of the elves, and they were made of stone, but their hearts of hatred." Another interesting quote is that the idea had already arisen that the orcs originated in mockery of the elves, but not yet that the orcs were in any other way associated with them. They were a creation of Morgoth's own, made from stone. Now as the years passed by, Tolkien kept developing their origins, and he began to integrate certain philosophies in his mythology that would start to define the origin of the orcs. So, for example, one of his beliefs was that rational life could only be created by Iluvatar, the god of Ea. And so, in these later versions of his story, Morgoth could no longer create life, he could only corrupt life which already existed. Frodo actually shared some insight on this when he told Sam, "The shadow that bred them can only mock, it cannot make, not real new things of its own. I don't think it gave life to the orcs, it only ruined them and twisted them." Or as Tolkien himself put it, "I have represented at least the orcs as pre-existing real beings on whom the Dark Lord has exerted the fullness of his power in remodeling and corrupting them, not making them." Because of this new concept, the origin of the orcs would have to change, and they would now become corrupted elves. In this new version of the lore, Morgoth would learn of the elves' awakening before the rest of the Valar, and he would send out phantoms and some of his Maiar spirits to haunt their dwellings. There were also stories of a phantom rider that would ride out to capture any elves that strayed from their companions, and these elves that vanished into the darkness were never heard from again. This rider would carry them all the way back to Morgoth's fortress of Utumno, where they were enslaved, and through slow acts of torture and cruelty, Morgoth would corrupt them into the hideous race of the orcs. To quote, "Yet this is held true by the wise of Eressëa, that all those of the Quendi who came into the hands of Melkor ere Utumno was broken were put there in prison, and by slow acts of cruelty were corrupted and enslaved. And thus did Melkor breed the hideous race of the orcs in envy and mockery of the elves." Now most people are familiar with this origin, and they sometimes assume that it is the final version, since it's brought up in the main storyline. Though Tolkien actually wasn't really happy with it, and he left a note in one of his manuscripts that the orcs were not elven in origin. There were two things that seemed to bother him in particular. According to Tolkien, only Iluvatar, the god of Ea, could give rational thought and free will to creatures, and since the orcs could sometimes mutiny or rebel against their masters, then they must have independent wills and a spirit. And so, they too would be corruptions of a pre-existing creature. However, if this were the case, Iluvatar would never allow it to happen, not unless the orcs were somehow redeemable or savable, since otherwise it would imply that the power of evil was ultimately stronger than the power of good. This led to a new origin of the orcs, in which they were once beasts that were corrupted by Morgoth, and he used his powers to twist them into human-like shapes so that he could mock the elves and men. This allowed them to still be pre-existing creatures, but they would lack a rational soul or a spirit, for this could only be granted by Iluvatar. Their ability to speak wasn't a sign of independent wills, for they were actually just repeating lines or reels that were set in them by Morgoth. To quote, "Melkor taught them speech, and as they bred they inherited this, and they had just as much independence as have, say, dogs or horses of their human masters." This talking was largely echoic. Now, if orcs could sometimes rebel or mutiny, wouldn't that suggest that their will was actually independent to Morgoth's? And wouldn't that mean that they were rational creatures? So when Morgoth corrupted the beasts that would become the orcs, he infused them with his power and will, and so their spirit was actually the hateful will of Morgoth. It was this hate which made the orcs uncooperative, and so whenever they rebelled or mutinied, they were still being driven by Morgoth's will, and it wouldn't betray their allegiance to him. Now, there is a Tolkien manuscript from the same time that he was working on this origin, in which he implies that orcs might have actually had a mixed origin. He wrote that even though orcs were once mindless beasts, Morgoth might have mated them with elves and men, which is why they might have an elven strain. To quote, "It remains therefore terribly possible there was an elven strain in the orcs. These may then have been mated with beasts, sterile, and later men. Their lifespan would be diminished, and dying they would go to Mandos and be held in prison there till the end." Now, chronologically, the final origin that Tolkien came up with, and probably the most canonical, is that orcs were once corrupted men. In this new version of the story, the awakening of men actually took place before the Great March of the Elves, and Morgoth would capture and corrupt these men to turn them into the first orcs. What's interesting is that at first, Morgoth didn't see the orcs as a weapon of war, but instead he chose to corrupt them to defile the creations of Iluvatar as an act of blasphemy and mockery. Sauron was actually responsible for turning the orcs into a weapon of violence, for after Morgoth was taken captive, Sauron escaped and hid in Middle-earth, and under his watch and guidance, the orcs multiplied fast, so that by the time Morgoth returned to Middle-earth, he found the lands infested by orcs. Even Christopher Tolkien wrote that this origin was probably Tolkien's final idea. To quote, "This then, as it may appear, was my father's final view of the question. Orcs were bred from men, and if the conception and mind of the orcs may go far back into the night of Melkor's thought, it was Sauron, who during the ages of Melkor's captivity in Aman, brought into being the black armies that were available to his master when he returned." Now it seems that when men serve an evil lord, such as Morgoth, Sauron or Saruman, they could be reduced to an orc-like level of mind and habit after a few generations, and when they reach this level of depravity, they could mate with orcs to produce new breeds that were often larger and more cunning. This is how Sauron and Saruman created the Uruk-Hai and Goblin men, for we're told that there is no doubt that long afterwards in the Third Age, Saruman rediscovered this, or learned of it in lore, and in his lust for mastery committed this, his wickedest deed, the interbreeding of orcs and men, producing both men-orcs, large and cunning, and orc men, treacherous and vile. Speaking of goblins, I'd like to clarify that orcs, goblins and hobgoblins were all the same type of creature, they're just different names. I know that in other works of fantasy, they often refer to different creatures, but Tolkien himself stated that these names can be used interchangeably in his works, though he himself actually preferred the term orc. I'd also like to clarify that when it comes to reproduction, orcs reproduce in the same way as elves and men, and so there must have been orc women. We just never hear about this part of their lives, since we always see them in war and battle. Before ending this video, there is one other orc origin which I'd like to talk about, because it's actually quite interesting. So after Morgoth turned evil, he corrupted many Maiar spirits, and some of the weakest ones took on the form of orcs. They would obviously be much more dangerous than your typical orc, and they had terrifying demonic characters, and they would often lead the orcs into battle. Because of their Maiar origin, even if these orcs were slain, they could eventually reform their bodies. And this is why throughout the history of Arda, we sometimes see the names of great orc leaders that reappear in battle, even after many years have passed. We also know that these Maiar orcs would sometimes procreate with typical orcs, and this would cause them to become weaker and more earthbound, for they would lose some of their demonic power. Eventually their spirit might become so weak that they wouldn't be able to reform their bodies, and they would be doomed to roam Middle-earth as a weak evil spirit. Anyway guys, this wraps up today's video, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the various orc origins. Which one do you like the most, and why? Personally, I really like the one where they have an elven origin, I suppose. I think it's kind of cool seeing, the noble, long-lived elves who are, quite pure or good-natured, who through torture, cruelty, and, Morgoth's influence get turned into orcs. It's quite tragic, and it creates a really cool dichotomy, between the elves and the orcs, their history. So I like that one. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. As always, I'd like to give a quick shout out to all my patrons that choose to support this channel. Your help and support are deeply appreciated, particularly my Valar tier patrons, Michelangelo and T. Gorman, and also my Wizard tier patrons, Andrew Bomer, James Tudgel, Mike Feeney, and Roland Mirvold. If you too would like to support this channel while unlocking some cool perks, I'll be leaving a link to my Patreon page in the video description. You can also support this channel by checking out our store, or by following us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and joining our Discord server. All of these links can be found in the video description. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe to join our fellowship today. I hope to see you all in my next video, where together we'll once again explore the magical world and lore of Middle-earth.